this is not an artificial product. It's not, as you said, that the Masoretes sat down and said, okay, here's the half verse marker. It's that this has been preserved extraordinarily. This has been preserved since before the fall of the Second Temple. The way naturally that the text is read.
Shalom and welcome to Hebrew Voices. I'm Dr. Nehemia Gordon with this year's SBL reactions. And joining me from last year is Nelson Calvillo, who's a research assistant at the Institute for Hebrew Bible Manuscript Research. And for the first time joining me for SBL reactions is Dr. Kim Phillips, who is a research associate at the Taylor Schechter Geniza Research Unit, an affiliated lecturer at the Divinity Faculty at the University of Cambridge Biblical Hebrew, and last but certainly not least, a research fellow at the Institute for Hebrew Bible Manuscript Research. Shalom, Nelson and Kim.
Shalom, good to see you.
Shalom, Nehemia. Shalom, Dr. Kim Phillips. Great to be here.
Thanks for joining me, guys. So what we've done in the past, Kim, is everybody shares what their top lectures they went to at SBL. SBL, for those who haven't seen one of these before, is the Society of Biblical Literature's annual meeting. It's gone back to the 1800s. It's funny, I once in one of my articles quoted something from the 1905 meeting, and at that meeting there was 5 or 10 lectures the entire meeting. Well, now there's over 1,000 lectures, and so you can't go to all of them. There are lectures I wanted to go to that couldn't go because I was speaking at the same time and all kinds of things like that. So I'm going to let you start, Kim. What was the top lecture that you went to?
I think I'm going to have a pair of lectures, if that's okay.
Fair enough, absolutely.
Sophia Pitcher works in Masoretic studies, particularly focusing on the ta'amim, the accents. And she gave a couple of papers, one of them in the biblical Hebrew poetry section, where she was co-presenting with Emilu Grosser. And the other, she was presenting in the Masoretic studies section, and she was speaking alone at that point. And in both of the papers, she more or less gave us an overview and introduction to her very particularly linguistic way of looking at the ta'amim, the riddle of the ta'amim. And
tell the audience what ta'amim are. Let's assume people don't even know Hebrew, and what are the ta'amim?
Okay, so when you open a Hebrew Bible, you are faced with a whole sort of gamut of information on the page. First of all, you're faced. Let's say it's a Tiberian Bible Codex. You're faced with 3 columns of the biblical text, assuming it's one of the prose books. So, say Genesis through to 2 Kings or 2 Kings, whichever I meant to say, Nehemia. I remember from last time that.
No, it's fine.
Genesis.
No, I've since found out that it's a very British thing to say, 2 Corinthians and 1 Corinthians and 2 Kings. So that is something British do in general, I found out.
Okay, phew. Okay, good. So let's say it's one of those books. There are others in 3 columns as well, but let's just say it's one of those. And at the top and the bottom of the page of this Masoretic Codex, and in the margins of the 3 columns, you've got all of the Masoretic notes. We're not talking about those. We're talking about the biblical text itself. The biblical text itself is formed up of 3 different strands: the consonants, the consonantal text, and then a series of dots and dashes above and below those consonants, and sometimes in the middle of the consonants themselves, representing the vowels. But then, in addition, a whole nother set of lines and dots which represent the accents. So the vowels and the consonants are together sufficient for somebody just to read the biblical text. So, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, etc. I didn't need any accents there, except to know that haaretz was the end of the verse. So I guess I kind of did need an accent, sort of. But the accents are in the Tiberian Bible. They appear on every single word. And the big question, the question that has occupied scholars for centuries now, is what is their primary function? We know a cluster of their functions, but we're still really trying to pin down what is it at root that these accents do. I'll pause there in case somebody wants to respond, but I can carry on.
No, I mean, I'm riveted. Keep going, Kim.
So, well, we can list some of the things they do. Generally, the accent, as it appears on each word, will appear on the accented syllable of each word. So, melech, king, is accented at the beginning of the word. But if I take the same consonants and put in some different vowels, malach, he ruled, then you can hear that the stress is at the end of the word. So usually, not always, but usually the accent appears over the stressed syllable. Melech at the beginning, malach at the end. That's one thing. That's the kind of easiest part. Most scholars, I think, agree that in some sense, the accents show how to divide the text into sense units. I deliberately put that pretty vaguely because I think that expressing it like that, almost everyone would agree that to some extent it shows where one unit of sense ends and the next unit begins.
Can you give us an example of what you mean by sense units? I mean, Nelson and I might know, but maybe the audience doesn't.
Sure. Yeah. Let me open up a Hebrew Bible here. In fact, since we were working from Genesis 1 just now, let's do so here.
To give another example of, you talked about accent. So, for example, the word Elohim that you read or you recited by heart, we know it's Elohim and not Elohim, right? Now, Elohim isn't a thing in Hebrew, so that's why your example was better, Melech and Malach, or Katavti and Katavti, right? Or Vikatavti, right? There it actually completely does change the meaning. So anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So as I said, every word more or less in the Tiberian Bible has an accent, and those accents. I'm already running into problems here. We're trying to get an example of how the sense is broken up by the accents. So back to Genesis 1:1. According to the accents, I would read it like this in terms of sense. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So I break it up. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we can kind of sense already intuitively in English how, I'm going to already be taking sides here, but how pausing or lengthening at certain points in the sentence just gives a very different sentence. So, for example, if I were to say, to learn Mazorah, you must study hard, then I would be saying something quite different to if I was speaking to let's say, a young lady called Mazorah, and let's say that there's a textbook that I'm saying that she has to study, and that textbook is written by a guy called Hard. So in that sense, I would say to learn Mazorah, you must study hard. Whatever I'm talking about, whatever field or discipline, let's say it's economics, Mazorah can only learn about this economics if she studies the textbook by heart. So even there in those two example sentences, to learn Mazorah, you must study hard, and to learn Mazorah, you must study hard. We can see that the way that we pause, the way that we divide up the individual groups of words makes a difference to the meaning. So that is another aspect of what the accents do. And just finally, the accents as a third element, at least nowadays and for centuries, but we're not quite sure how far back it goes. But for centuries, we can say at the very least, the accents have also indicated the various melodies by which the biblical text is sung or is chanted, is cantilated. I'll pause there.
That's a great explanation. I want to bring an example. This is an example that the medieval commentators talk about, Deuteronomy 26:5. This is when the Israelite, there's a ceremony where you bring this basket of your tithe and you present it before God, and then it says, Arami Oved Avi, which is always translated, I think, my father is a wandering Aramean. And so you actually have, now that I'm thinking about it, this is a mishpat shemani, a nominal sentence, right? So the word is, it actually doesn't even appear there, right? It's implied by the juxtaposition of these two nouns. So the way the accents divide that up famously is Arami, Ovedavi, an Aramean destroys my father, destroyed my father. And then the rabbis explain, well, who's the Aramean who destroyed my father? That is Laban, who tried to destroy Jacob. And which is like, what? No, this is talking about Abraham, who's the wandering Aramean. He came from Aram Naharaim, Aramea between the two rivers of Mesopotamia. But the accents actually seem to indicate a different interpretation of the phrase, that it's referring to Laban, who tried to destroy my ancestor, my father. And so there's an example where the accents are contrary to what we would expect the plain meaning to be. And maybe we're wrong, or the accents are taking a side against the plain meaning. That's possible too, right?
In that case, I think that the example of Laban was attempting to destroy Jacob is also represented in Targum Onkelos, if I remember correctly there.
Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I know for sure that's an early rabbinical midrash, and then it seems that the accents are giving the breakup of those three words in Hebrew, Arami, Ovedavi, according to this midrashic interpretation rather than the pshat, and maybe that is the pshat and we're just wrong. I don't think so, but so it actually can affect interpretation. So, all right. So what was, and we've actually in previous SBL reactions talked about Sophia Pitcher's hypothesis, but I'd love to hear it from you. What I find so intriguing about it is, look, I gave a paper. I don't know that my paper is going to, well, maybe it will actually. I don't know. Most papers that you hear aren't going to fundamentally change the field if the hypothesis is accepted. Whereas if hers is accepted, this is a game changer. So tell us, what is her hypothesis now that you've explained the overall scholarly approach to the accents?
Well, okay, I should give a disclaimer that Sophia is working from a very, very heavily linguistic framework, and that's pretty new to me. So I'm still very much trying to piece together my understanding, new word by new word. There is so much terminology in this field. As far as I understand, Sophia is using a linguistic model called prosodic phonology, which I had to look up. And I think that all that means is that when we speak, we cluster words together, we use different speeds, we give different words different pauses, different stresses. Sometimes our voice goes up, sometimes our voice goes down, and all of those different elements, sometimes our voice goes up in pitch, sometimes our voice goes up in volume or down in volume, etc. So those are the kind of contours that we're very, very used to when we actually speak, but which linguists now study very, very formally and try to understand how is it cross-linguistically, so across different languages, how is it that pitch or volume or stress or pause or rhythm, how are they used? How do they all combine into the grand process of making sense of what somebody is saying? I think that is more or less prosodic phonology. And Sophia, if you're listening, forgive me, please, if I've got it completely wrong.
Well, she's promised to come on the program and explain her hypothesis, but the audience might not hear that for another year. So let's give so you're sharing the gist of it.
I hope I'm sharing the gist of it. Yeah.
So the big departure that she's presenting, really from my perspective, is what she calls the continuous dichotomy theory or model, or I forget what she calls it exactly. Law of continuous dichotomy. There it is. LCD. And I was taught that at Hebrew University of Jerusalem as fact. Fact. and that this was common knowledge, say common knowledge, the audience, not you guys, you could if you want. And she's coming along and saying, no, that's not correct. And what's so amazing to me is one of my teachers at Hebrew University, Simcha Kogut, he has 2 books on the accents. And in both of them, he's analyzing how the medieval commentators reacted to the accents, but all of his reactions assumed the law of continuous dichotomy. Well, now maybe we have to go back and look at what these medieval commentators said if the law of continuous dichotomy is wrong. Or more importantly, maybe it's still right, but maybe they didn't know about it. And we had this conversation as we were walking back from one of the lectures, Kim, about William Wicks. Yeah. And so she says, Sophia Pitcher says, William Wicks invented the law of continuous dichotomy. And when I heard that a few years ago, it blew my mind because I thought that's just a fact. It's common knowledge. Ibn Ezra is engaging with the law of continuous dichotomy. And I forget who all the other rabbis were. Radak is engaging, like these are examples from the Middle Ages. Mm-hmm. But who says? Maybe they looked at the accents in a completely different way, and we don't necessarily know what that way is. Maybe they were wrong, but we can no longer take the law of continuous dichotomy for granted. To me, that's the biggest challenge of her research, whether she's right or not.
Yes. The more I dig into it, the more I think that actually lots of useful parts of what we learned with LCD can be maintained. Now, I think Sophia would want to push back against that and say, no, we need to have a whole new framework. But yes, in essence, what Sophia is saying is, look, we now know this prosodic chronology. We now have analysed how languages rise in intonation, fall in intonation, and in pitch, etc., etc. And actually, what the accents are doing is marking that for the reading of the biblical text, which is a very beautiful matching of a phenomenon that we see in the biblical text, in the Masoretic text, with the sort of phenomenon that linguists are studying from modern spoken languages. And to my mind, it's quite sort of intuitively plausible, because over the last 2-3 decades, I think one of the major strands of development of understanding within Masoretic studies in general is that the Masoretes really didn't make this stuff up. It's not that they sat down after the Talmud was finished and thought, right, okay, what are we going to do now? I know, let's get to work on the biblical text. It's not. And so what the Masoretes weren't doing was sitting down with a bare consonantal text and working out word by word, or which vowel should we put here, which accent should we put here. That's not what they were doing. They had received an oral tradition of the correct pronunciation, the correct reading of the biblical text, which had been preserved orally for centuries. And so what the Masoretes are doing towards the end of the first millennium is finding ways to write down what had been passed on to them orally, namely the correct way that the text should be read, the correct places where the text should be emphasized, the correct places where your voice should go up and should go down and where you should pause. And what Sophia is saying, yeah, absolutely. And the accents are part of that big picture. I think that just makes really good.
Wow. This reminds me of like one of those, I forget his name, it's one of the 20th century physicists who came up with this like rule to explain like how like, I don't know, subatomic particles work. And he said the law knew more than I did, or the formula knew more than I did. Like he came up with this formula and then he started to discover things based on his formula. And what you're saying is that, I think what she's saying is, I think what you're saying as well is that what I was taught at Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the 90s was that I don't know if this was said explicitly, but it was kind of implied that the Masoretes decided, okay, this is the middle of the verse, we'll put an nachta there. Now this is the middle of the first clause, we're going to put an accent here. Now this is the middle of the first half of the first clause, we'll put an accent there. And what Sophia seems to be saying, and I think what a lot of the work of Jeffrey Kahn and his students really bring out, is that they had this oral recitation, And these people are referred to in the Talmudic sources as Baalei Mikra, the masters of scripture, people who are reciting the scripture. And then you also had Tanaim, who were reciting the oral law, right? You had people who would recite these vast knowledges of information without necessarily understanding everything they were reciting. They just knew, here's where you put this word and here's how you pronounce that word. And then the Masoretes came along and said, how do we record this in graphic form? And that's where they might not have understood the linguistics behind it. They just knew, here's where your voice goes up, here's where your voice emphasizes, or here's where your voice kind of like has a trill, right? Like I'm thinking of the shalshelet, right? Assuming that's what it really is, right? Vayit mahamea, something like that, right? Where you're kind of pausing and really emphasizing that word. So they had these linguistic patterns that they recorded with graphic symbols, and this is why her explanation is so attractive. To do what scholars have told us for centuries, we don't need more than 5 or 6 symbols, right? You have 2 melechs, a mishneh, let me count my fingers. 2 melechs, you have 2 kesars, a melech, a mishneh, and a shalish. And then you have a conjunctive accent, and 6, and you're done. Maybe you add 1 more just for some disambiguation or something, right? We don't need all the numerous symbols that we have. So the explanation was, well, that's for cantillation, and we're not really interested in cantillation, right? That's what I was that's actually what I was taught at Hebrew University, right? Why do we have more than 6 or 7 symbols? Because that's for the cantillation. They're chanting it in the synagogue in some kind of stylized way. Okay, why are they doing that? So she says they're doing it because that's how people spoke. Wow.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that if I'm reading her correctly, then she's saying, look, this is a natural language phenomenon. That phrase comes up quite a lot. So to come back to what you were saying, this is not an artificial product. It's not, as you said, that the Masoretes sat down and said, okay, here's the half verse marker. It's that this has been preserved extraordinarily. This has been preserved since before the fall of the Second Temple. The way naturally that the text is read, perhaps in a stylized kind of a way, in a kind of very intentional, formal, stylized kind of way. But nonetheless, it is a natural language phenomenon, and therefore it should be accessible to be analyzed using the tools that we know from other natural languages. And that's exactly what Sophia is doing, as far as I can understand it.
Well, we're going to stick with that until she comes on the program and corrects all of us.
Yes, that's right.
All right. I'm going to bring my, I wouldn't say it's my favorite lecture. In all sincerity, my favorite lecture was Kim's lecture. But we'll save that for a different discussion. We'll do maybe a whole episode just that. No, it was mind-blowing because it brought up some issues of how I've been dealing with the manuscripts, where I have to now second guess, okay, so I need to reevaluate a lot of what I've been doing with some of the manuscripts, because there's different, and I knew this, there's different types of manuscripts. I've talked about this. I've written about it. I've taught it, but I never applied it in the way that you apply it. So we'll save that for a different lecture, or a different episode, not lecture. So my favorite lecture was Kim's, but then the one I want to talk about is I went to a review of a book written by Dan McClellan, Dr. Dan McClellan. He is, he's actually quite famous as a TikToker. And he actually referenced that in his, he was responding. It was basically a review. You had several people, scholars, who were giving reactions to his book, which is about, I forget what it's called. Nelson, if you can Google it, it's like The Nature of YHWH, which he pronounces as Adonai, or something like that. And what he's talking about is what was the understanding of God, of deity, in ancient Israel. And then they had several scholars responding to his view, and there was some critique, but by and large, they agreed with him. And what I found so interesting was the reaction of one of the critics. I forget her name. Actually, I never knew her name, I'll be honest. So I'm sure she said it at the beginning, but I didn't know a lot of these folks who were speaking. And she said that what she's looking for when she studies the religion of ancient Israel is whatever the biblical text was opposed to, that was the original religion of ancient Israel. And I thought, wow, she said the quiet part out loud, because that is the approach that a lot of particularly critical scholars of so-called higher criticism of the Old Testament. And look, I deal with what's called lower criticism, and it's called lower because it's lower on the page. Not that it's lower in importance, but textual criticism. But the people who are trying to figure out how the biblical text was written in the first place, she explained her starting approach, or what she's really interested in, I should say, is what was Isaiah opposed to? That must have been the folk religion, the original religion, even the official religion of ancient Israel. What was Jeremiah opposed to? That was the religion of ancient Israel. And I thought that was such an interesting way to explain it. Okay. What did you find the name of the book, Nelson?
I think so. The one that comes up most recently is, and I'm going to pronounce it Yahweh just because I think he's
but he says Adonai, actually.
Oh, okay.
He pronounces that Adonai. Yeah.
So it's Adonai's Divine Images, a cognitive approach.
Okay. Oh, yeah, and a lot of it was the cognitive approach, which I don't know that we need to get into. But I thought her comment was so interesting that if Deuteronomy is telling you to cut down the Asherah poles, that's because Asherah was the original religion of ancient Israel, and YHWH, Adonai, Yahweh, however you pronounce it, had a consort, which in a sense is correct, but is that the original religion of ancient Israel, or was that a corruption of the religion of ancient Israel? And then it depends, do you believe the prophets, as we have them, were inventing a new religion and coming out to oppose an existing religion? Or were they the official, original, and official is an interesting word, because if you went to the court of King Manasseh, even according to the Tanakh, yes, Asherah was the wife of God. And if you didn't believe that, you'd be executed for heresy, right? Or if you didn't bring the sacrifices, maybe, I don't know. Now I'm making stuff up, right? I don't know if she actually execute people for heresy. I don't know if they had that concept, right? But definitely, it talks about in the time of Josiah, they were taking all these idols out of the temple. So her approach, and I forget her name, I apologize to her. We should try to find out, Nelson, and interview her. Her approach is, no, that Josiah is making up a new thing. Before that, all the ancient Israelites worshipped in that way, and Josiah is inventing a new approach. So I'll let you guys discuss.
Gosh, I have thoughts, but I don't want to hog the conversation.
No, please. We want to hear what you have to say.
Well, my first thought is how strikingly that uncovers the preconceptions and the pre-understanding that you're bringing to the table. So, and I'll explain what I mean. If you are willing to accept let's call it a hypothesis for now, that God really did appear to a bunch of quondam slaves at Mount Sinai, and really did enter into a special relationship there, and really did reveal something of his nature, and etc. Then, to my mind, that pretty decisively answers the question: okay, what is the original or authoritative religion of Israel going to look like? And so, for somebody to be willing to entertain different understandings of what the official or religion or official religion or popular religion or whatever, it suggests to me that there is a kind of default assumption. Okay, we're assuming there was no Sinai, or we're assuming that if there was a Sinai, it doesn't. What we have in the biblical text isn't a faithful reflection of what was spoken there, and therefore all that we're left with is this kind of historical soup from which we need to kind of drag out the various ingredients as best we can from inscriptions, or from reading between the lines of the biblical text itself, or from archaeological remains, etc. So I think if I've understood correctly, that's quite a nice demonstration of how this whole business of biblical criticism actually depends a huge amount on on your pre-understanding that you actually bring to the text before you start reading it. I'll pause there.
I think they would openly say that. I don't think that's something they're hiding. Meaning, if I'm going to put words now into the mouth of the lady whose name I can't remember, which is always a dangerous thing because maybe I'm wrong. But I think she would say, well, that's the approach of a conservative apologist to say that God actually revealed Himself at Mount Sinai, and we have to, as historians, assume that that's not the case, and that was all made up later. And then when they approach the New Testament, they'll say the same thing. That I'll give you an example. Like James Tabor has said, as an historian, I can't engage with Jesus rising from the dead. What I can engage with is people believe that Jesus rose from the dead, which is actually more than people are willing to stipulate in the case of Mount Sinai, right? And I agree with the statement in the sense that as critical historians, I don't know that we can say that, I believe God revealed Himself at Mount Sinai. But the question we can engage with is, did the ancient Israelites believe? Whether He actually did or not is a question of faith, because we weren't there. But did the ancient Israelites believe that? And I think these folks would say, no, that was, that's like about saying, that they look at that as like legends about King Arthur that they were made up hundreds of years later. And I think you're absolutely right, Kim. It shows their starting preconceptions, and I'll even use the word bias. And I don't have a problem with them having a bias, because I have a bias when I study Islam. I don't believe the angel Jibril revealed himself in a cave to Muhammad, but I also believe that Muhammad's disciples believed that the angel Gabriel revealed himself, and maybe Muhammad himself believed that even. And so here we have to, I think, distinguish between faith and what we can talk about as critical historians. They definitely have. So here's the problem I have with their approach. I think they would say they don't have a bias, and we do. And I think we should acknowledge everybody has some sort of a bias, right? My starting assumption is that God did have this covenant with Israel.
Yeah. I think acknowledging that we all have biases is very important, rather than sort of lobbing it like a brick over the fence to explain why they're wrong. It's because they're biased. We all have biases. We all start from a particular place. But I think what it does sometimes make me want to think is, well, I want to listen to what you say because I can see that you're a good scholar. I can see that you're going back to evidence. I can see that you're doing the work carefully. But equally, if at any point you say, therefore you are wrong for believing X, Y, and Z, I want to say, well, really? If I started from your set of assumptions, maybe, but why should I start from your set of assumptions? What if I have other good reasons for thinking that there really was a revelation at Sinai? Then already we've started from very different places, and so we're going to interpret the evidence differently. So it gives me a kind of caution before I get too worried about some of the things that I hear getting said. From my faith perspective.
To me, this is this sort of missed opportunity. If you believe what the prophets say, then the Israelites were influenced by the Canaanite religion, and so if we want to understand that Canaanite religion, and let's say you went to the average house in, I don't know, northern Samaria, somewhere in the year 850 BCE, and you said, okay, what is it you believe? How do you practice your faith? I think they probably might not be too far off on their conclusions. In some ways not. But then the question is, how do we explain that? How did that come to be? And if you asked one of their priests in those days, they might actually agree with Dan McClellan and say, no, this is the original religion, and those people down south and that pesky prophet Hosea, he is coming to destroy our ancient faith. And we are the conservatives who are preserving the religion of our ancestors that goes back to Moses. Right? That's the whole point of Judges, of that story of Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, or apparently Moshe, is that it seems that the people at these high places had a chain of tradition that brought their faith, claimed their faith went back to Moses. And the prophets we have in our Bible disagree with them. So most of them anyway. Some of them don't really refer to that necessarily, but most of the prophets seem to disagree with them. Maybe all of them.
Sure. I wish I'd been at the session. It sounds very interesting. I certainly think that examining ancient Near Eastern sources, examining the epigraphic evidence as well, that we've, etc., is very, very informative. I don't have a problem at all with saying that some of the images that we see in Scripture are taken from ancient Near Eastern mythology, ancient Near Eastern ways of understanding the world. In fact, to my mind, when you look at the comparative data, it seems blindingly obvious. But that I don't have a problem with that at all. How else? If a preacher today doesn't use images and metaphors that are relevant to today's culture, he's not going to be understood. And in the same way, if the prophets back then, they were communicators, so they had to use images that were meaningful, viable to their audience.
That's a profound statement, Kim. And the example that comes to mind is where it talks about God in I think I want to say it's in Psalms, and it uses a bunch of metaphors that we have that are in the ancient Near East applied to Baal. Right? He's the rider on the clouds, and he's the one who brings thunder and lightning, and I may be misquoting it, right? But something to that effect, right? But that doesn't mean that they worship Baal. It means that, I'll use a modern Christian terminology when they talk about Christmas. They'll say this is a victory for the church, right? That's something I hear a lot, that there were, some people say, well, Christmas has pagan origins, the Yuletide log and all that. Okay, but if you're trying to convert a bunch of pagans in Norway, and they're not going to give up this symbolism, what you can do is reinterpret that symbolism as applying to Jesus rather than Zeus, right, or something like that. And it's not the exact same thing, but I think maybe there is some parallel. It is a similar strategy. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm aware that I haven't really given Nelson much chance to respond, but I remember distinctly a sermon many years ago, and it will clarify to the people of the relevant age how long ago this was, when the preacher was talking about our access to God in prayer, and he was saying that in Christ our access is like broadband internet rather than dial-up internet. It's which, if I was trying to preach a similar sermon today, I wouldn't be able to use that, because people would go, what's dial-up? Well, I haven't got a clue. And so it was an example there of an image or a metaphor being used, which was incredibly bound to a particular period of time. 20 years earlier, people wouldn't have had a clue, because what on earth is broadband? 20 years later, people wouldn't have a clue, because what on earth is dial-up? But for that short period of time, it was a metaphor that spoke to people, that communicated. And so he was right to use it at that time.
I think that's the perfect way to end, Kim. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Nelson. Shalom.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Hello, boss.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemia Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemia's McCore Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiaswall.com.